I say in the chat there, I'll welcome you in a moment, that this is being recorded if you have no objections to that. And I see some chat going on over here, so I'll just go ahead then and thank you, as I was about to her information, various women and romantic science, a Nasser Science, Medicine and Psychology Caucus event. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really excited about these papers today. I think they're just so exciting, and it's going to be a wonderful event. So I'm Michelle Faubert from the University of Manitoba in Canada, and I'll be the moderator today. And this is how I envision the panel is proceeding. I'll have questions prepared for each panelist, and in my response, I had the benefit of reading them before today, so that was fun. And so I can ask those questions. We'll go through all of the papers first, and then I can ask those questions of the panelists when they finished, to give the audience time to form their questions, and then we'll open up the discussion to everyone. Or, you know, if people are kind of ready on the mark and they have questions going, and for example, if there are even questions in the chat, then we can go straight to those, and I'll just make sure that, you know, there's kind of good coverage for all of the papers in that case. So I want to be flexible here, but just to let you know what I see is part of my job here. So if there are no questions to begin with, then in the interest of time, again, let's get started. So we'll begin with Colleen English's paper. Colleen English is from Loyola University, Chicago, and the title of the paper is "Midst Rosanna's Groves to Science Dear, the Affective Internal Landscapes of Mary Tighe's Psyche." So please take it away, Colleen.
Thanks so much, Michelle, and thanks again to Lisa Ann, Michelle, and Dahlia for organizing this panel. So in 1812, Quaker poet and chronicler of the Irish peasantry, Mary Leadbeater, writes a tribute to fellow Irish poet Mary Blatchford Tighe, author of Psyche, that she encloses in a letter to Melusina Chevenou Trench, which reads, "Genius of Spenser, dost thou hover near the favored banks of Mulla's pastoral stream? Or midst Rosanna's groves to science dear, lovest thou to bid thy former lustre beam?" It is one among many poetic tributes to Tighe, whose untimely death from consumption elicited poems from Thomas More, Lady Dacre, and Felicia Hemans, among other 19th century literary figures. These tributes speak to the great influence of Tighe's epic poem and reinforce her reputation as a major Romantic era poet. But Leadbeater's encomium specifically locates Tighe in both the allegorical literary tradition of Edmund Spenser and the material realm of the family estate in Rosanna, County Wicklow. Leadbeater's rhetorical question, commending Tighe to science dear, while somewhat curious and ambiguous, does situate Tighe's poem within a scientific discourse and provides a frame of analysis worth exploring in more detail. In particular, this presentation examines what Psyche reveals about romantic theories of the mind and women's participation in romantic science in Ireland during the tumultuous Union period. Tighe's Psyche can, in general terms, be viewed as a poem about the formation of the soul through sensation and experience, thus enabling a connection between the poem and broader discourses regarding theories of the mind in philosophy, medicine, the nascent field of psychology, politics, and theology circulating between the British Isles and Ireland during this time. In selecting Apuleius' myth, which features a woman who pursues empirical knowledge by disobeying the orders she is given to not gaze on the physical form of her lover, Tighe brings women's agency, exploration, and desire for material proof of the bodily register of emotions to the fore. As pioneering Tighe scholar Harriet Kramer Lincoln argues, the epic poem, quote, utilizes Psyche's transgressive gaze to critique the romantic ideology of the female subject and, quote, asserts the power of women poets to see and speak with visionary authority. Positioning Psyche within the overlapping fields of poetics and science also helps solidify the reputation of this female poet, who up until recently has been subject to what Stephen Barrett called the double erasure of Irish women romantic poets because of their gender and their nationality. Tighe did benefit from an early advantages. She received an unusually rigorous education as a child under the supervision of her mother, Theodosia Blatchford, which included the study of English, French, Italian, history, science, and philosophy, among many other subjects. Later in life, she was treated by some of the most prominent physicians of the era, Dr. Robert Bree, who later treated John Keats, Dr. Henry Vaughan, who provided medical care to George III, his successors, and other members of the royal family, and whom she addresses in a late lyric poem. And she inscribes a copy of Psyche to, in fact. Her brother, John Blatchford, whom she greatly revered, was a founding member of the Dublin Library Society, whose holdings included Joseph Priestley's Experiments in Observation on Air and David Hume's Essays on Suicide and the Immortality of the Soul. Tighe's reading journal indicates that she read Hume's work with great interest, particularly his essay of the delicacy of taste and passion from Essays, Moral, Political, and Literary Part 1, from which she records the following passage. Quote, "Nothing is so improving to the temper as the study of the beauties either of poetry, eloquence, music, or painting. They give a certain elegance of sentiment to which the real of mankind are strangers. The emotions which they create are soft and tender." In this essay, Hume indicates that while people who are disposed to either passion or taste are both fragile, those inclined towards passion suffer more than those with delicacy of taste. Happily, those with delicacy of passion rather, can cultivate taste and therefore remedy their predilection through the arts, poetry, music, and painting, thus underscoring the transformative effects of poetry in the cultivation of emotions. Tighe's interest in moral philosophy and science of mind is further evidenced by correspondences with Joseph Cooper Walker, an Irish antiquarian and writer, as well as a founding member of the Royal Irish Academy. Julia Wright notes that many of the societies in Ireland during this period were concerned with civic participation and improvement through education, a project which, quote, located literary theory as a branch of the philosophy of mind. And certainly the Royal Irish Academy and the United Irishmen are both sort of part of that. So the transactions of the Royal Irish Academy, which again, from Wright, pursued a scientific approach in which literature was, like phenomenon such as the weather, a set of effects with causes that could be analyzed through models consistent with accepted principles through theory. She observes that in this publication, quote, RIA members drew on vitalist terms and logic to explore the causes and effects of literature. While Tighe's knowledge of the transactions cannot be conclusively demonstrated, it is apparent that Tighe envisions her psyche as located within a literary theory that takes the human mind and human emotions as its subjects. Like the vitalist theories of John Abernethy, Tighe's poem is concerned with the life force in the motions of human physiology. Psyche is an embodied soul, a quote, exposed heart, and her emotions are displayed through her body, through her trembling nerves and blushes. Psyche's Spenserian epic places particular emphasis on the protagonist's, quote, sympathizing heart, as well as the receptive, sympathizing ear of the imagined reader, demonstrating a concern with the cause and effect of her literary production. The desire to communicate effectively and the anxiety surrounding the transmission of Psyche's tale is clearly seen in Canto 5, where the, quote, dreams of Psyche hold the speaker, quote, soul in willing thrall. And she desires the ability to transform this vision to, quote, communicable shape so that, quote, other hearts be ravished with the strain. The concern here is with the transmission of the tale that reaffirms a belief in the effective circulation of sympathy through the medium of poetry. The poem is notable for the way the eponymous heroine's physical journey through the symbolic landscape in a quest for love conflates interior mental states of cognition and external landscapes by sentimentalizing the famous allegory of love and the soul, which many of you will be familiar with. It was an immensely popular story from Apuleius's The Golden Ass, and the influence of that myth is really seen in the first two stanzas, first two cantos of Tighe's poem. Psyche in her journey traverses the landscapes of the Isle of Pleasure in Canto 1, the Bower of Loose Delight in Canto 3, Disfida's Castle of Doubt and Suspicion Casabella's Palace of Chastity, The Coast of Spleen, Glycella's Isle of Despair and Indifference, and encounters a great many figures in these places, such as vanity, selfishness, ambition, who pose challenges to her quest to obtain the water from immortal beauty's sacred spring in order to gain the approval of Venus, Cupid's mother, and thereby reunite with Cupid and gain immortality. In its tendency to represent emotional states such as despair as geographic landscapes or mythic beings that Psyche, an embodiment of the human soul, must overcome to reach her lover, Tighe's poem quite obviously enacts the formation of a soul. What is striking is that the environment of the poem are both meant to be physical topographies and interior states of being. Thus, like the soul, they are both distinguished from the corporeal frame and at the same time necessary components of that form. In this way, Tighe's poem echoes the contemporary scientific and philosophical debates surrounding the immortality of the soul. As James Chandler notes, the governing discipline of Tighe's poem is, quote, psychology, the explanatory science that takes the soul for its objects, firmly situating the poem within the realm of scientific inquiry. And yet the ending of the poem retains a spirituality consistent with Tighe's Methodist upbringing. In the poem's conclusion, Psyche, united with Cupid at last, achieves immortality, an ending which appears to eschew the materiality of the body and leave no room for the materialist theories that reject the existence of the soul. But perhaps that is Tighe's point, that science and philosophy must be careful to, quote, make not a senseless doctrine thy false choice, as she declares in her 1790 poem. Philosophers are invited to praise God, taking heed against false philosophy, which goes on to praise scientists such as Isaac Newton, Jean-André Deluc, and Charles Bonnet, who acknowledge the existence of God. Either way, Tighe's masterful Psyche can perhaps best be understood by contemplating Tighe's alleged last words, "What is life?" Thanks very much.
That's just great. Thank you so much, Colleen. Wow, I just love that you make such a convincing case for Tighe as a major romantic writer, right? And outline her reading influences in ways that show her expertise in philosophy and science. And this is something that's so often denied to female writers of the period. So this is really important work. Thank you. And I see, yeah, you have some big kudos going on in the chat there too. So that's fun. So wonderful. We'll move on now then to Renee Harris. Renee's from the Lewis Clark State College. And the title of Renee's paper is Joanna Baillie's DeMontfort and the Gothic Sympathetic Nervous System. So please take it away, Renee.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to be sharing my screen for a PowerPoint here. All right. Joanna Baillie's Plays on the Passions experiments, let me see if I can, there we go, experiments with extreme emotional states to bring together the two male discourses of Scottish Enlightenment moral philosophy and medical science on the shared theme of sympathy, arguing for drama's unique function in the development of sympathetic faculties. She presents what can seem Gothic and supernatural in the body as perfectly natural and culturally useful. Joanna's brother Matthew Baillie published The Morbid Anatomy in 1793, and in 1798, Joanna Baillie theorized about humankind's morbid curiosity in her introductory discourse to the Plays on the Passions, a collection which she dedicated to her brother in its second edition. The morbid curiosity of humans, our attraction to the lowest and wickedest of men, Joanna says, is a desire to understand motives, to witness the unaffected character when, quote, that disguise is removed, which is imposed by respect for the opinion of others, end quote. She says that even those repulsed or too timid to go to an execution themselves will ask about it of the people who did go. Matthew's Morbid Anatomy shows morbid changes to anatomical structure based upon observation and study of dead bodies, from Dr. Hunter's collection and those available at St. George's Hospital. Fred Berwick offers a foundational comparison of the two siblings, how Joanna begins her literary career in the Hunter family home, and how her introductory discourse aligns with the complicated anti-dualism of Matthew's morbid anatomy. I present Joanna Baillie's plays on the passions as an artistic and extension and contribution to the revolutionary work on pathology her brother was already performing. Joanna's experimental plays create a means to read the morbid brain in action, locomotive, pre-mortem, prior to its becoming an object of medical science, when it could still be an object of the artistic and social worlds. As she says, with regard to the morbid curiosity, quote, romance writers therefore stepped boldly forth to supply the deficiency, end quote. Her Gothic drama DeMontfort presents family drama where brother and sister unfold the extreme emotion of hatred while simultaneously navigating the historical transition from a medieval religious and superstitious vision of the distressed or deviant mind to the modern medical understanding of passionate extremes. By taking on the unsympathetic, showing it as physiologically sympathetic, and showing our own morbid curiosity for it, she presents to us a Gothic sympathetic nervous system and the need for a changing social understanding that matches the medical advances of her time. Let's discuss the bodies involved in reading social situations. Reading is Joanna Baillie's preferred term for the process of observation in real life, as well as in the theater. And natural language is the term both Baillie siblings use for the physiological manifestation of cognitive and psychological processes. It's easier to communicate to another how a man wears his wig and cane, what kind of house he inhabits, what kind of table he keeps, etc. Her description of reading a person resembles the model from David Hume. Impressions form from observations of traits, words, and actions. These are then processed through the body and into the brain and lose their immediacy of that material sensory input, but solidify into opinions and ideas as they congeal in the mind. I have these flowcharts to help us. According to Hume, this process of understanding impressions into ideas can be reversed by sympathy, which acts as a vehicle by which sensation can be replicated. Ideas become sense impressions. So let's say we do not observe an execution ourselves. Instead, we are given a description. We activate the cognitive pathways that translate the idea of dread. We hear a description from our neighbor. We read one in the paper. We imagine the person's sweaty brow. We imagine the doomed man's slow, dragging feet as he approaches the gallows. We experience on our own skin a clammy chill, and our breathing slows. We feel as he does, engaging sympathy. The Marquis DeMontfort arrives at his residence in Amberg unexpectedly, himself unable to explain how he came to be there. Quote, "Oh, many varied thoughts do cross our brain which touch the will, but leave the memory trackless," end quote. He has run in shame from a duel against his longtime foe, Rosenvelt. In the duel, DeMontfort was bested but spared by his enemy. However, to DeMontfort's utter frustration, Rosenvelt too has come to Amberg. Under the guidance of his sister Jane, DeMontfort attempts to be courteous and sociable. Ultimately, he can control his outward expressions, though he cannot change his passions. And a rumor that Jane and Rosenvelt are to be wed completely undoes his efforts in civility. A classic trope of the Gothic, the veil takes on a dual resonance in DeMontfort as both a religious symbol that forbids accurate readings of characters' countenances, as well as a physiological veil underneath which can be read the interiority of deviance. The uninformed would need that veil lifted. They would need to be educated to read natural language. People around DeMontfort try to make sense of his disrupted mind based upon their knowledge of natural language, but in many ways, the Gothic veil of religious and superstitious belief denies them access to a modern understanding of his extreme passions. The Marquis describes his mental state in Gothic terms, and his emotions spiral. Rosenvelt haunts DeMontfort's mind and overtakes his focus. This aligns with the 18th century anatomical model of how the nervous system worked in a person experiencing extreme passion. William Cullen writes in his 1789 Materia Medica, for considering the effects of the passions upon the mind, passions of the mind upon the state of action of the heart. I say the passions which diminish the tone or action of the heart are proofs that the energy of the brain is constantly necessary. Fear is allowed to weaken the action of the heart as much as anger can increase it, end quote. In Cullen's newly delineated sympathetic nervous system, the heart pulsates in correlation with the state of mind. Likewise, Matthew Baillie, writing about the diseased brain at the level of dissection, says that elasticity in the brain of maniacs allows for structures to bounce back, though they appear dried out and friable. Quote, when these changes take place in the brain, the mind is at the same time deranged. There is either mania or lethargy, or the person is much subject to convulsive paroxysms. Throughout this speech, DeMontfort is gesturing wildly, banging things about and knocking them off of tables. And the Marquis's sister, Jane, enters the play as a veiled character, repeatedly seen as angelic or saintly. She is as of a previous era. She attributes his haunting not to mental disease, but to sprites. As for Jane, she makes a semi-modern proposal to cure her brother of his demon. She believes if he performs the outward signs of a clear mind, he will clear his mind. By reversing the cognitive processes to make the material into ideas again, he is fighting the supernatural beings that have taken control of him. To Jane's understanding, taking conscious control over his bodily manifestations of passion is fighting with the sprite. His brow unclouded and unknit. What we see here is the lingering of the opposite, the unconstruction, the active soul in the lifeless cell. Here's a snag in her remedy. As a representative of the medieval way of thinking, Jane demonstrates how the connection of mind and body is a long-held belief of the philosophical and medical community. Like their 18th century successors, early medieval philosophers maintained that, quote, the somatic manifestations of an emotion are essential to it. Thomas Aquinas argues that the emotions are psychophysical objectual states, end quote. Hence, for medieval thinkers, blood literally boils when someone is angry. Though he was studied for 4 acts, DeMontfort could not be reintegrated into the social world by his loved ones. Ultimately, DeMontfort's hatred for Rosenvelt overwhelms his reason, and he murders Rosenvelt and attempts to brain himself, only to die later of his injuries. Thomas Aquinas's 11 delineated emotions were all paired, including the binary of love and hate. The one outlier for him was anger. Augustine labeled anger as irrational, even post-lapsarian in City of God. Such thinking marginalizes the person experiencing extreme emotion, labeling them as inhuman, perhaps, or unnatural. a word repeatedly used to describe DeMontfort. For Jane, as a representative of medieval or Gothic thinking, we see how she is unable to accept DeMontfort's passion as natural. She instead attributes it to the supernatural, even as she attempts a natural cure. If sympathy is the connection of social beings and the communication of organs, the external and the internal are always already interrelated in seemingly inexplicable and ghostly ways. Joanna Baillie's plays on the passions extend the discourses of philosophy and medicine, sorting them out through art. In her dramatic experiments with morbid curiosity, she shows that we want to witness and understand the deviant mind. While at times the extreme passions seem Gothic and irrational, co-opting the mind and body, medical science reassures us that the brain is still in control, though sometimes that natural language remains veiled and what we witness appears demonic. By taking on the unsympathetic, Baillie shows us a Gothic sympathetic nervous system and the need for a changing social understanding that matches the medical advances of her time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Renee. That's just great. Wow, we're 2 for 2 for sure, and I suspect it'll be 5 for 5 by the end. This is a really strong beginning. This is just this paper, Renee, is just such great meditation in some ways on the usefulness of literature, right? As Percy Bysshe Shelley would say in Defense of Poetry, how literature allows us to use what we know to apply to social understanding, what what's otherwise kind of cold or even dead knowledge. So this is just just a useful paper in so many ways, as well as showing us more about how impressive Joanna Baillie's knowledge was. It's just great. Thank you. So we're going to move on next to John Savarese from the University of Waterloo. And the title of John's paper is Joanna Baillie and the Science of Song. So please take it away, John.
Thanks, and I guess I'm going to be kind of moving laterally from Baillie's drama to some of the other genres that she worked in. And I've got some slides here. Hopefully they're coming through and you can see them. I'll just start, I guess, by saying this this image here comes from a song that Baillie contributed to George Thomson's Select Melodies of Scotland, interspersed with those of Ireland or Wales. This is one, the Maid of Unwellan, that's become kind of traditional. There's a lot of folk singers treat it as if it's a traditional tune, although it's one that she wrote in order to be set to this air, which I believe was contributed by Haydn for Thomson's collection. And I'll just to get started, while Joanna Baillie laid out her scientific aesthetics most programmatically as a theory of drama, the same concerns inform her theories of poetry, musicality, and popular song. We know that Baillie was embedded in a culture of medical science, but what's really clinched her poetry's dialogue with medicine, rather than merely with the passions in general. And so we've just heard some of this from Renee. It's been the analogy between the stage and clinical observation, placing the viewer in the role of a diagnosing physician or the taxonomist of disorders, namely disorders of the passions. My interest today is to look at how that framework extends to her non-dramatic poetry too, with 2 points of reference, the national song or air and ballad, which, as she calls the metrical legend later in her career. Just a bit of bibliography for Baillie. From the start, Baillie framed her published poetry as a study of human nature, and as she developed her repertoire as a dramatist, she also collaborated over 2 decades with George Thomson for his collections of Scottish and Welsh airs. In 1821, Baillie followed Scott in the imitation of oral narrative poetry with her metrical legends of exalted characters, and her subsequent poetry collections gathered her contributions to Thomson's collections among her other poetry. My goal is to draw some lines of connection between Baillie's drama and those other poetic modes to see how the science of the passions runs through all of it. So I'm going to start with this bit of a fairly well-known section from the introductory discourse to Plays on the Passions, where Baillie makes a well-known pronouncement about the theater as a school for the passions. She begins that conceit, this is what I want to focus on, with a comparison between plays and ballads. She writes, "It was the saying of a sagacious Scotchman, 'Let who will make the laws of the nation if I have the writing of its ballads.' Something similar to this may be said in regard to the drama. Its lessons reach not indeed to the lowest classes of the laboring people, who are the broad foundation of society, which can never be generally moved without endangering everything that is constructed upon it, and who are our potent and formidable ballad readers. But they reach to the classes next in order to them, the drama does, that is, and who will always have over them no inconsiderable influence. The impressions made by it are communicated at the same instant of time to a greater number of individuals than those made by any other species of writing, and they are strengthened in every spectator by observing their effects upon those who surround him." So this is the theater as the space of mutual observation, that thus the theater is a school in which much good or evil may be learned. This passage has become so well known because it frames the theater as a school, and specifically in context, a school for moral lessons. It's in keeping with Baillie's overall argument in that it's a school for cultivating, training, and managing the passions to maintain their healthy functioning, and by extension, the health of society. But I want to focus on that first part of the paragraph, which sets this theatrical school up as an extension of a more distributed mode of observation and training that begins with ballads. For Baillie, the theater is a means of disseminating ideas to the middle classes of society, who, as she puts it, will always have no considerable influence over the lowest classes of the laboring people. And it's this, quote, broad foundation of society who are our potent and formidable ballad readers. Readers, again, coming up there, too. Renee noted that reading is her favorite term for this kind of thing. Even though she's talking about ballads, she is very much framing ballads as a species of writing, and thinking about the way that impressions are communicated to a great number of individuals through, in this case, printing, though again on analogy with dramatic performance. This ballad populism also has behind it, I think, a broader background of the ballad revival, which is with its theories of oral transmission. Baillie's scientific aesthetics, allowing spectators to observe human nature through simulated experiments, predates her dramatic program, and it influences her poetics more broadly. While it might be less intuitive to see ballads as clinical observation, the introductory discourse explicitly analogizes them with the stage's surgical theater. Baillie differentiates those modes according to class and uses the language of improvement. What the theater can do as an institution, in tandem with the improvement of medical institutions, is to advance the work the popular ballad was already doing. This would be in keeping with the main line of Enlightenment theories of poetics, ballads, and musicality, where from Thomas Percy to Joseph Ritson, antiquarians framed the origin of song as a medium for cultivating and improving a society from its origins to a modern developed state. And for some evidence of this, we can look to George Thompson, a collaborator with Baillie, a musician best known for his work with Robert Burns and as a collector of Scottish songs. Here is Thompson from his collection of the songs of Burns, Scott, and other eminent lyric poets, among whose eminence, by the way, Baillie was included. He writes, "There is hardly any people, however rude, that has not its music. Music is not merely the most innocent and refined pleasure which a rude people can enjoy, but a powerful instrument in quickening the progress of improvement by cherishing the best feelings of our nature." So musicality has this interesting role in antiquarian discourses at this time, where it's a feature of a kind of natural origin of art, but is also an instrument that is used as a kind of technological means of improvement. Ballad antiquarians from Joseph Addison forward had made popular poetry a similar sort of training medium, often in terms of cultivating a popular intellect. As a theory of music, in terms of what Maria Semi has called music as a science of mankind in 18th century thought, Thompson links the musical explicitly to the progress of improvement, and most notably for his connection with Baillie as a means of cultivating feelings. As a musician, first and foremost, who really outsourced the work of lyrical collection and composition, Thompson is thinking of lyrical content and instrumental music both as playing a role in the passion's cultivation. For her part, Baillie didn't really know the tunes for many of the songs that she wrote for Thompson, and she seems to have remained ignorant of what many of them were, in that she had some of them played for her, but some of them she never really found out what they sounded like. Her main concern was to write songs to set to the proper meter for whatever musical arrangement would be needed. Her letters attest that once printed, she had some of these songs played for her on the piano, but some of them she might never have heard at all. And I think it's important because it speaks to the kind of division of labor that she understood very experientially as a part of the institution of music. It's not that in this case that the theater is an institution and music is sort of sung or disseminated by an individual. Actually, music does function in some of the same, well, it's not centered in buildings, so it's not centered in an institution like the stage itself. It's still the product of a concerted effort by different hands. Writing to Thompson with one of her contributions, she explains, "I have therefore done what from some other expression in your letter seems to be more your idea, written a simple song of the same measure with His boat comes on the sunny tide, in which, as you desire, I have praised the power of music, or rather song from the heart, and have alluded to the 3 countries of these kingdoms who have national music and whose airs you have published." I'm not going to read the song out, but it's on this next slide. A kind of meta song that she writes about the function of song, specifically its role in the musical cultivation of national feeling, something that operates in tandem with and on analogy with the education and acculturation of infants in Baillie's letters to Thompson. It's a metatext about song's work, but it also shows how Baillie, like Thompson, thought of song as a medium for cultivating and regulating feelings, both at the individual and the collective level. It's all about the role of song as a group or national level sort of ideology, something that trains the proper passions at the proper time, or something that cultivates and enforces different types of group feeling. It's a good example of how Baillie thought of songs and of music as a means of transmission, working in that same medium of the passions as drama. But just in the interest of time, I want to quickly talk about how in her metrical legend, she also describes narrative ballads in other ways that bring them in their own ways closer to her theory of drama. And this is where I'll conclude just with this bit from Metrical Legends. The preface to Metrical Legends theorizes history and the memorialization of the dead, of great men. She's interested not in the fictionalization, she's interested in the people's relation to and their curiosity about true past events. Like the plays on the passions, she roots this through a theory of general mental propensities. Specifically, she relates narrative poems to a social passion, an interest in recounting and imaginatively recreating, embellishing, or exaggerating the doings of other people. So she writes, in relating a true story, how often do we spontaneously, almost unwittingly, add descriptions similar to what we know must have belonged to the actors and scenery of our story? In imitation then of this human propensity from which we derive so much pleasure, I have written the following metrical legends. This is characteristic language for Baillie, where she speaks in the first person plural about those things that she presumes all people have in common, and these desires that we all have and that we all tend to spontaneously, without thinking about it, always do in the same way. If we compare this to, say, Walter Scott's essay on the imitation of the ancient ballad, or Anne Radcliffe on the supernatural in poetry, Baillie differs by attributing poetic excesses to a very ordinary interest in other people, in making inferences to fill in gaps, inferences, as she says elsewhere, about descriptive detail, but also motives for action, those kinds of ascription of intentional states that drive social intelligence, which may be fairly inferred from the situation. What's interesting to me is how, as with dramatic poetry, Baillie is building songwriting into an account of basic mental powers or propensities tied to the same social passions that characterize more formal and institutional modes like drama. So just to conclude, I think it might look like there are 2 different things going on here. On the one hand, Baillie's routing drama and ballad poetry back through a basic inventory of human mental propensities. They're adjacent to the sciences of mind insofar as they tell us about how we think about other people, and they provide cases to observe and to exercise those interests and abilities. On the other hand, Baillie is interested in literature as a set of institutions or modes of dissemination, scaffolds or schools for training those propensities and exercising or regulating the passions. Those are connected, however, because Baillie, like Thompson, like Adam Ferguson, and like many other historians of artwork, took a more distributed view of how the mind works and how it develops historically, and saw those media of transmission as part of the way that passions, sensations, and ideas develop in individuals and in society. And that's as true of drama as it is of ballad poetry and the national air. Thanks.
Thanks very much, John. Another wonderful paper on Baillie. How great is this? Thank you. So, the work being accomplished by scholars in this session is certainly helping to make Baillie the major figure in Romanticism that she should be, and is she's slowly gaining ground in this respect. And I'm just so happy to see this excellent work coming forth. And John, you introduced us to a little recognized but clearly important aspect of her song. So I'm so excited to talk about this in greater detail after the papers. Thank you. So our next speaker is John Mulligan from Rice University, and the title of his paper is Non-Observationalism in Romantic Science, So please take it away, John.
Hi, everybody, thanks. Can you guys confirm for me that you can see this? Full screen PowerPoint? All right, fabulous. I timed this at 12 minutes. Today, I will suggest that Caroline Herschel, Dorothy Wordsworth, and Bridget Riley can be understood as practicing what Deleuze called a transcendental empiricism in the domain of vision. Dorothy Wordsworth's compositions try to find perception's internal infinitudes by feeling out its manifold margins. Caroline Herschel attempts to account not simply for the stars, but for their infinitely precisely receding distances. And Bridget Riley reorganizes the relations of quantification and perception in her mural in the National Gallery titled Messengers. As I have argued in my writing on Blake's Newton, Cartesian visuospatiality, at its limits, achieves the appearance of what we call organic form, and the figure of the impassive, distantiated observer naturalizes its form of life. I read in Riley, Herschel, and Wordsworth an aesthetics and a history of visual spatial abstraction that is orthogonal to those ways of seeing, knowing, and feeling that we've become too accustomed to. So, Dorothy. Dorothy Wordsworth has recently been read as the ecologist in residence of their home in Grasmere, but at the cost of pigeonholing her as a caretaker and amateur botanist. When we use Dorothy de Grand Williams' putatively masculinist transcendental subjectivity, we plant her too firmly in Grasmere with a tendency to presuppose a natural ecology and a gendered division of labor that we find her journals poking fun at. If this is botany, nobody is keeping samples. If it is ecology, it is without a nature. If it is women's work, it is not domesticated. The whole landscape is in flux with a collective and hardly heteronormative desire. Botanists attempting to pin down a locale believe they are chasing plants, but these plants are following women who are themselves in search of the perfect place for a flower. Consider, as a figure of this epiphytical transplantation, the siblings' productive abstraction of the figure of the glance. In the Daffodils poem, we find the figure of the glance representing a moment of instantaneous recognition. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. This poem has traditionally been read as a valorization of transcendental subjectivity, but also has been recuperated according to the logics of radical materialisms. The figure of the glance appears in Dorothy's March 4th, 1802 entry on the Daffodils, in reference to the whitecaps on the waves, but it also appears in her slightly earlier well-known entry for November 24th, 1801, on their favorite birch tree. It was yielding to the gusty wind with all its tender twigs. The sun shone upon it, and it glanced in the wind like a flying sunshiny shower. It was a tree in shape, with its stem and branches, but it was like a spirit of water. Rather than a reimagined landscape, we see a situated biographical observation, whose figure appears to us in very good company. And, in place of Williams' instant and unified image of thought, we are overwhelmed by glances as a kind of monstrous prosopopoeia, as a shattering of any stable, single perspective. This breathtaking encounter holds together, but under the threat that at any moment, this entity will fix its numerous gaze fully on the human viewer. This brief discussion hews closely to Marjorie Levinson's recuperative reading of the Daffodils poem's never-ending line. Using Georg Cantor's famous diagonal proof that traces out an incountably infinite set's line of flight from a countably infinite set, Levinson shows that Williams' slight weirdness of pairing never-ending with margin of a bay helps us to see this special kind of open-ended infinity. I would simply add that this profound challenge to the crude infinity of the Kantian mathematical sublime can be seen being worked out in a decades-long exchange between Dorothy and William about their inheritance of late neoclassical visuality. I have more glances examples, but they don't figure. Caroline. Caroline Herschel's work represents a paradigmatic shift in the nature of astronomy. Do you guys see that? The stars? Caroline Herschel's work represents a paradigmatic shift in the nature of astronomy into a data-driven science. And indeed, this marked a watershed in scientific discipline formation, but the enormity of her achievement has been somewhat obscured by the understandable desire to rescue her biography from the drudgery of the work she did. The Royal Astronomical Society, founded in 1820, represented the first break of a specialized discipline from the Royal Society's umbrella organization. Its founders, including Charles Babbage and John Herschel, understood this newly specialized science as an enterprise of industrial knowledge production, and their observational procedures set the standard for precision measurements in the 19th century's increasingly mathematized sciences. Caroline, John's aunt, became one of the earliest recipients of the RAS's gold medal in 1828 for her numerical catalog of 2,510 deep sky non-stellar objects discovered in partnership with William Herschel, John's father and Caroline's brother, during their 1783 to 1802 sky surveys. This data-driven approach necessitated a refusal of what we call data visualization. Caroline translated the beautiful Atlas Celestis of John Flamsteed into tables of small, numerically determined zones that they could meticulously and serially comb over with their high-powered telescope. Their workflow necessitated this informationalization of observation. William observed at such high magnification that it was hard to determine where and at what he was looking. And Caroline observed indoors, windows open in a lit second-story room with records and instruments at hand in order to hastily process the observations her brother shattered from the telescope scaffolding. Are either of these activities rightly called observation? The aesthetics and epistemology of data science are implicated by the problem of automation alienation. The simulator we're looking at here attempts to capture the sort of on-the-clock boredom or slow anxiety that attends routinized knowledge work. It reproduces second by second what William Herschel would have seen through his eyepiece as they slowly swept a small band of the sky, oftentimes nothing, which they did successfully about 1,335 times. And what William apparently failed to recognize until he had committed to this workflow was that when he turned his sister into a bookkeeper, the same method of observing effectively turned him into a camera. He attempted to wrest some creativity back from this knowledge discovery engine that they had created, but there was very little left to be had. It is not overstating the case to say that William's stars had not properly been discovered until Caroline turned out the tables of the deep sky object's coordinates for publication. Astronomy had, by that point, moved well beyond the visual to the more profound question of what the limits might be to what could be observed. Bridget. In Bridget Riley's recent paintings, Richard Schiff introduces her sheared triangular fractal patterns and pale grid sunspot patterns as radical reinterpretations of some of her earliest geometrical work. Radical because these new paintings constitute returns to the roots or elements of perception. Nullity, he suggests, is generative of these works' extensibility. Outside the Sackler family gallery of romantic masters, just on the other side of Constable's Wall, is an atrium stairwell that immediately gives one a sense of floating. A patchwork crosshatch of pastel impressions holds the eye in thrall. These messengers, I think it is clear, come from elsewhere, but that does not mean they are not there. And if this painting could be said to have an explicit message, it seems to me that it would be that we can see them. Riley's intensification of color and scale within this indented layout radically transforms its structure by intensifying the operations of her principle of nullity. The circles have been increased to the point where they're just shy of equal to the distances between horizontal and vertical neighbors. Where in her earlier work, the circles hang in a crosshatch grid, here they fill the grid to its limit and doing so draw out our perception of the null space that surrounds them, into which they could just barely interleave. Computer scientists have already approached such sparse banded matrices as that in the second diagram in the bottom left here, imagistically, by seeing the sparsity as a feature which would allow them to losslessly compress information on a shared storage device, as in supercomputing clusters message passing interfaces or fast interconnects. This very notion of lossless compression implicitly poses a challenge to those critiques of information technology that present compression as inherently alienating. Instead, it enables communication, although that communication is admittedly quantified. But where the information theoretical applications for this sparse pattern take for granted the cleaning sampling that goes into the data they receive, Riley demonstrates how the maintenance of nullity loss is integral to this regulative ideal. To the extent that messengers can productively be understood as interfacing with the mathematics that attend the computational transformation of the sciences that has proceeded in parallel with her artistic career, Riley's messengers communicate a dream of abstraction in which our modern technologies of purification can be looked at straight on. The white-on-white subtraction that allows for the layout of other colors to have an appealing pattern is only heightened by our knowledge that these layouts, themselves reductions of reductions, can be losslessly compressed. This firm footing in abstraction, despite its airy reach, informs us that there are ways of meaningfully and collectively understanding the apparently chaotic elements of our highly constrained systems. So, concluding. The rational and calculative techniques of the observer can get carried away with themselves, and what I find most compelling in Wordsworth, Herschel, and Riley's ways of seeing are their highly practiced methods for taking this excess in another direction. In Herschel, this looks like an accounting of human labor stretched to the dimension of cosmic space-time, that is, so thinly that its moments are best understood as a massive system of arbitrary relations. To return to Dorothy Wordsworth's glances, landscapes and daffodils do not stay fixed as the scenery, and neither does she wait for this to happen. In her best act of bad botanizing, in my opinion, we see her transplant a strawberry bush into its own location. I found a strawberry blossom in a rock. The little slender flower had more courage than the green leaves, for they were about half expanded and half grown, but the blossom was full spread out. I uprooted it rashly and felt as if I had been committing an outrage, so I planted it again. It will have a stormy life of it, but let it live if it can. It is as though she was trying to make this thing an epiphyte, a plant that lives without soil. As Forrest Pyle puts it in his radical aesthetic formulation, abstraction can function as a cultivation of non-relationality. In the above cases, the abstraction of observation takes its rules seriously, and so makes us see differently. Riley puts it in terms rather like William Blake did to Thomas Butts, when she said that, quote, the medium both carries you and threatens to carry you away. Immersion in Riley's sparse work abstracts us, yes, by enforcing an apparent distance from our accustomed perspectives, but it restricts itself to doing so in a novel access or to an extreme degree in order to transform our world's apparently natural and constitutive order. Thanks.
Thanks very much, John. Another really thought-provoking paper. You give us so much to think about in a short paper. It's amazing. You know, what, to quote you, what Deleuze calls a transcendental empiricism in the domain of vision, which seems like such a contemporary idea that I'm just amazed to see its presence in the Romantic period. So yeah, in many ways, the paper is kind of an intellectual history of that concept. It's just great. And so we've come to our final paper of the panel today. It will be presented by Lisa Ann Robertson from the University of South Dakota. And the title is, She Thinks for Herself, Exploring Women's Participation in Mind Matter Debates. Please take it away, Lisa.
Thank you. I'm going to share a PowerPoint here. Is that visible to people? Yes, okay. All right, if I do this quickly, I can get through it in 10 minutes. So what I want to talk about today is a very little known novel called She Thinks for Herself. It was published in 1813, and as far as I can tell, it has not been published since, and was only available through the British Library or Echo until about 2018, when I guess Google must have digitized it. It was published anonymously, but according to the British Fiction Database, it was written by a woman called Harriet Hughes, and I don't know if she's related to Felicia Hemans or not. So this is what I'll be talking about, and I think I don't know why, but I sort of have this concern that maybe this author and this novel aren't really doing science in the way that we think of doing science. However, when I first encountered it, which is probably about 3 or 4 years ago, and I read it, I was incredibly struck by the way that it engaged with the mind matter debate and with mind science. It takes many of the same issues that male philosophers were wrangling with and writing about, but it recontextualizes them for young, middling class 19th century women, which is to say she puts them in context of courtship and marriage. The other thing that struck me is the way that the plot and the subplot seem to function as case studies. So quick plot summary here, just the plot, is that it follows the adventures of an orphan, Selena Dudley, and her fiance Frederick Unwin, and they can't get married until Frederick establishes himself financially. So he moves to London to become a clerk. She moves to London to become a ladies' companion. And this is important because it ties to what I'm going to argue is the model of women's mind that Hughes is trying to advance. So instead of staying with the Unwins, which she would have had a right to as a future daughter-in-law, she wants to earn her own money. She wants to take care of herself. She wants to maintain her independence. And so when they're in London, their relationship is sort of under constant siege by Montague Dorian, who's this wealthy rake who wants to ruin Frederick and seduce Selena. And so the plot sets up sort of a series of mental and bodily tests that the characters sort of undergo in order to demonstrate certain principles. There's also a whole bunch of complex subplots also involving various star-crossed lovers of certain types that explore these issues as well. So for example, there's one young woman who ends up becoming mentally deranged because she relies too heavily on the authority of other people, her mother, her priest. So then the last thing that really sort of struck me about this novel is that it's putting tenets of mind science in conversation with earlier novelists in order to challenge representations of women. So the argument that I'm making is that Hughes uses the novel's genre's formal intertextuality to advance a model of women's minds as competent and capable and no weaker than men's minds. And so this, I think she might, this is where I think maybe her intervention is, and this is where she's sort of maybe doing science. Along the way, she also makes an argument that women's best strategy for navigating patriarchy is to cultivate clear-minded, independent thinking. So the novel sets itself up very explicitly at the intersection of a couple of discourses, and it does this by having an opening frame in which we get this strange narrator who remains nameless, but she's plump, and she's an old maid of 40 years old, so way over the hill. And what she situates herself explicitly in this lineage of 18th century authors, some heavy hitters, including Samuel Richardson, Frances Burney, and Anne Radcliffe. And even though she says, that she can't compete with them, she does in fact engage topically and modally with their work. The other thing she does, and this again explicitly sort of sets the novel in the mind matter discourse or the mind science discourse, is that she positions herself as an expert in the workings of the human mind, and this is the occasion for the story. So the whole narrative is, it has to do with the fact that this plump old maid is an expert in the human mind. So I'm going to talk really quickly just about her response to Richardson. So Hughes challenges Richardson's model of femininity advanced in Pamela. I think this is part of a very long gender contest that is present in the novel since the rise of the novel. And so I see Pamela as a particular model of femininity who has a fairly passive model of virtue. And with respect to the mind matter debate, she relies a lot more on her body than her mind. So if you think about the ways in which she responds to Mr. B when he gets too sexually aggressive, her mind shuts down and her body takes over, and she has these violent fits that then startle Mr. B into propriety. So what Hughes does is she reworks the whole last half of Pamela Volume 1 in order to represent Selena as a woman who doesn't need to rely on a man because she has the mental and bodily fortitude to save herself. So if you've read Pamela, you'll remember there's this long episode in which Pamela is kidnapped by Mr. B and she's imprisoned at his country house, overseen by a masculine woman. Similarly, in the third volume, Selena is kidnapped by Montague Dorian, imprisoned at his country house. And one of the biggest differences is their attempts to escape. So first of all, Pamela enlists the help of a man, Mr. Williams. And then when she does try to escape on her own, she gets scared by the bulls, or actually just cows, and then she passes out. Whereas Selena finds a crack near her bedroom window, and she spends the several weeks of imprisonment working at loosening the stones by picking out the mortar with her penknife. She's eventually able to knock out a stone, and she descends through the aperture, reaching the ground in safety. She does this by tying a sheet around her waist. And then she just walks to the nearest village, finds a farmer, and gets a ride to a town where she can take a coach to London. So I think this alternate ending is arguing that women's bodies best serve them when they are strong and capable, and that women have the same mental competency that is generally attributed to men. So she makes implicit comparisons between men and women's minds through her fiance, through Selena's fiance, Frederick, who serves as a foil throughout the novel, but just within this abduction episode. So when he first finds out that she's kidnapped, he becomes so overwrought that he becomes ill, and he ends up delaying his ability to go find her by making himself unfit to travel. Then, when he does find out where she's located, he impulsively and obstinately insists on setting out right then and there, even though it's the dead of night and it's hardly safe to drive. And then, this chase is described as the carriage advances really, really slowly, and then they run up along a bank and they're overturned, and the whole rescue mission is aborted. And we can contrast this to Selena, who's sort of slowly and methodically maintaining her presence of mind and, affecting her own escape. Additionally, Hughes explicitly engages with some philosophers of mind, and I'll talk about her engagement with Elizabeth Hamilton. So Elizabeth Hamilton wrote a series of popular essays published the same year, in which she also takes on issues of mind and explicitly situates herself within the mind science debates. And she says, perhaps not one of 1,000 connects the ideas of education. Sorry, I can't see my screen. Connects with the ideas of education any notion of the general improvement of the faculties of the human mind. Now, in this somewhat amusing scene, when Selena is first introduced to London society and she's asked about her opinions on child rearing, she says, I hardly know which is the most destructive to the powers of the human mind. Difficult as is the task of education, yet it appears to me that there is no art less generally studied. And then, of course, the London ladies titter and say, oh, I suppose the young lady's been reading Mrs. Hamilton's letters. But I think what is going on here is there's this explicit reference to Hamilton. Both of them do hold the same position, which is that one should be thinking about the principles of the human mind if you're going to, educate and rear other human beings. So there's this explicit alignment there. Then she makes an allusion to James Baillie, which I think is actually really important. So I think what Hughes is doing is invoking Baillie to make a feminist argument about women's minds. And again, this is an interesting scene where Selena and her future sister-in-law are taking Alexander Pope to task for his representations of women, and their Quaker friend, Mrs. Barclay, says, well, let's not read Pope, let's have a little good sense out of Dr. Baillie's essay on truth. So James Baillie was a Scottish philosopher who popularized the common sense theory of mind in an essay on the nature and immutability of truth. And in it, he says, the mind perceives truth not by progressive argumentation, nor from education, nor from habit, but from nature. It acts according to an established law and acts in a similar manner upon all, or at least upon a great majority of mankind. And so I think that the allusion here is bolstering Hughes' argument that men and women's minds are governed by an established law. So there's not two laws, one that governs women's mind and one that governs men's mind, but in fact there's one law and it governs all minds. And so, it's a way for her to bolster her argument or to support the model that she's trying to advance. So I'll just conclude by saying that throughout the entire novel, Selena refuses to rely too heavily on other people's opinions or judgments and their suggestions. And she consistently demonstrates rational thinking that enables her to navigate the travails of an unmarried heroine without having to rely on men to protect her. And Jacqueline Lottie argues that there was this period of flux in the 1790s when women novelists experimented with different gender definitions, but by the 18-teens that had sort of evaporated and novels were returning to specific gender definitions and assignments and appropriate rewards and punishments at the end. However, in this book, the clear-thinking, rational, able-bodied heroine is rewarded in the end. She's not punished. So, I mean, I'll just reiterate my my argument here is that she thinks for herself, uses theories of the human mind to articulate a new model for womanhood based on, or new model of women's minds based on the idea that there is, in fact, I'll misquote Mary Wollstonecraft, there is no sex in mind. She said there's no sex in soul. Anyway, that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Well, what a great way to cap a wonderful panel. And thanks for introducing me to a new novel. I wasn't aware of this novel at all. So it's great. And it sounds pretty funny too. So I'm really attracted to it. I must read it. And I have to say her work sounds so promising for our shared interest here in the period study of the mind, and particularly with reference to how it can inform social issues, right? Such as the role of women in the period. So it's really thought-provoking. Thank you. So I will open the floor for questions. So if anyone has a question, you can, if you happen to have your camera on, you can wave your arms around and I will likely see you. If you don't, please just let me know in the chat. But while you're thinking, oh yeah, thanks. It is just a wonderful panel. While you're thinking about things that you'd like to ask our wonderful panelists, I'll get us started. So maybe I'll just take it from the top and start with the first paper with, hang on, I've got to go all the way to the top here. Here we go. Start with Colleen English's paper, Midst Rosanna's Groves. So yeah, this great presentation on time makes a convincing case for her as a romantic writer for sure. But I had one question, and maybe you kind of suppressed it a bit in the presentation over the kind of written copy, but you do mention, Colleen, the importance of the Act of Union in 1801. And, but you don't really go into detail about it in the paper. So I wonder, how might this have affected Tighe's reading of Psyche, or how might that tie into what you're saying about the topographical references, or geographical, I should say, references in the paper?
That's a great question. Thanks so much, Michelle. Yeah, I didn't, unfortunately, have, just due to time constraints, much time to kind of fully consider the influence of the Act of Union on Tighe's psyche. And really, I mean, when you think about a lot of the writing that we see around the Union period in Ireland, it's a lot of kind of the marriage plots, right? We see in fiction, the Wild Irish Girl, Sidney Owenson's novel. So I think in some ways, Tighe is kind of inserting herself into that kind of debate. And certainly there's a lot of allegories about union. I think Mary Jean Corbett has written about this. But with Tighe, we really do see this kind of, I think a lot of what she's doing with sympathy, especially the journey the journey that Psyche takes is very much informed by the kind of tumultuous Union period. So essentially, this idea of bringing together love and the soul is her attempt, I think, in many ways to kind of bring together both sides. She's somewhat ambivalent about her stance on whether she's pro-union or anti-union. Her husband, Henry Tighe, is very anti-union. But Tighe expresses a lot of sympathy with the United Irishmen, even as she kind of obviously disavows the violence that's going on at her time. So I think that in many ways, the kind of landscape, the Isle of Pleasure with Cupid, it can be read as a kind of attempt to kind of go back to, in some ways, a more harmonious state of being following this Act of Union. So it's definitely, and I think as well with the kind of idea of the sympathizing heart, it's again attempts to kind of bridge or bring together the different sides in there. And it's interesting, actually, we see later in kind of I want to say the 1890s, there's a reference to Tighe's poem that reads the Isle of Pleasure in Psyche as being a great description of Ireland, of the kind of topography of Ireland. And she has written a few other topographic poems about Killarney as well. So there is a connection there that I'm sort of sorting through between the landscape of Ireland itself and then the mental landscape that Psyche is kind of coping with in the poem.
That's great. Thanks very much, Colleen. Excellent answer. And I see we have a question by Chris Bundock in the chat. I wonder, maybe I'll just read it. And if you want to tack anything on there, Chris, you can, and otherwise we'll pass it over to Renee. Okay, sounds good. I see your thumbs up. So you say, Renee's paper touches on something I've been trying to think about recently. How does anatomy function as a genre and as a way to organize knowledge in the 18th century? What distinguishes an anatomy? Right, it seems like such a broadly used word, yeah. And distinguishes an anatomy as a way of knowing something from other forms of knowing, such as treaties and essays and reports, histories. And if anatomies can be performed on objects that are not literal bodies, is the body still somehow informing and shaping such a study? These are great questions. Thanks, Chris. And Renee, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. I love this question so much. Yeah, this is fascinating because where this paper started for me and kind of the imagined kind of vision for it, where it fits into another project, is Isabel Armstrong, who looks at the gush of the feminine, or talks about the gush of the feminine with romantic women writers. And with anatomy, what I see kind of the word anatomy and morbid anatomy, and in particular, Matthew Baillie and Joanna Baillie, she is extending, what I argue is she's extending his project. She sees in his introduction to morbid anatomy a problem. She sees that, well, he can only study dead bodies, right? He says, well, I don't have actual cases to study. I have a limited number from William Hunter's, collection, and I have a few that I saw. I saw one or two at the hospital, but I've never actually studied, these deviant minds or these morbid brains in particular for her, right, in real life. So I only have a couple cases in real life. So what I argue in kind of the longer version of this is that she is fulfilling a deficiency. That's where romance writers, she says, can step in. So for her, an anatomy is dissecting, is looking at things that are stagnant, perhaps, that are fixed and delineated. And so this is maybe the masculine discourse. This is maybe kind of where the gush of the feminine, or where kind of an artistic, not necessarily feminine, not necessarily gendered or anything like that. But that's, another argument Isabel Armstrong might make. But this is where the excessive or the Gothic or kind of the extreme passions in action can step in. So I'm really interested in, kind of the anatomy that you're pointing out versus these other genres, essays, of course, meaning trials, experiments, right? So it's almost as if anatomy in itself as a kind of scientific term is set up in opposition to experimentation, which is what I was discussing as well, which is trial. And then, so where do bodies and anatomies come in? I didn't get that far in your question, so I'll have to think more on that, or someone else can kind of step in and think. But that's a very interesting add-on as well.
Thanks a lot, Renee. And I wonder if we couldn't put you in conversation with John Mulligan in that sense, because John, so interesting. And you're showing how these women artists are not necessarily tied to this entirely empirical way of knowing that, say, an anatomy seems to point to. And so in some ways, John Mulligan You're pointing out that, you know, there's a kind of another way of knowing and of seeing that is not just tied to kind of studying, say, a body on a table. This what might be taken as this kind of masculinist form of observation. So I wonder, yeah, John, what do you think of that question about anatomy, or would you say that this is kind of a feminine move, like a feminine turn in reading in the period and beyond, because it's not only Dorothy Wordsworth that you study and Herschel, is this a kind of a female culture thing that they're not necessarily so tied to observational knowing as an anatomy?
I don't think it's coincidental that they're women. I would be hesitant to overly determine it in that direction. I actually have a piece on anatomy that came out recently on Chardin, who does something, and give me 1 second.
Sure. And I see there's more chat. I love to see this. This is one of the things I love about Zoom, that, you know, we can keep the conversation going in the background and then come back to us. Please go ahead, John.
Yeah, one of the upsides of this horrible medium, right?
Yeah.
So this is perhaps the strangest anatomical diagram I've ever seen in my life, which is why I kept it separate. And it's the final plate in this anatomy manual from the 1720s, I believe. That's like, you know, the height and decadence of neoclassicism, where you see the hip bones turning into the top of this Grecian column, and this perfection of the body. You'll see that the body parts aren't labeled, but rather they're designated according to a Cartesian grid, which is how they're throughout the book. So that way the image stays cleaner, right? And the reference points are all XY coordinates for all the body parts in this in this anatomy manual. And what you see there is are these half dissected eyes, right? They're being peeled back progressively, that are admiring the geometrical perfection of his body. It's one of the most disturbing images I've ever seen. I didn't have room to put that in the Chardin article, but the Chardin article shows how anatomy is weirder than we allowed for. And Chardin's able to tap into that, in fact, because he doesn't get a particularly good training in drawing models, because the studio he was trained in couldn't afford them. And so he knows embodiment and anatomy through anatomy manuals. So you get this strange abstraction of the human body, these floating bodies that like are these, you know, these heads inside of gowns, basically, right? So I'm sorry that I couldn't not talk about that. So I guess just one, to put a button on it by way of addressing the actual question you asked me, the empiricism that I think is being played with here, what I'm trying to underscore is that they don't work from common sense. What they, or perhaps that could be their starting point, but they take known procedures and they use them in unexpected ways in order to produce novel phenomena, and that aren't readily categorized, and they produce proliferation. Yeah, of course, you can't always categorize it after the fact, but they produce a proliferation of novel phenomena that challenge, and they you know, they cherry pick, especially Dorothy. They cherry pick these examples that challenge, you know, the prior frameworks that produced the other exemplars. That would be the short version.
That's excellent. Thanks a lot, John. And we even got a show and tell into the deal, so that's fantastic. Thanks.
I've been waiting for so long to bring that thing out. Thank you.
I love that.
It's on Mother's Day.
It's amazing. That's so cool. And I see the conversation is running along a pace in the chat. So let's see, Dahlia says, how about the anatomy of the book? Oh, I like that. Right, the anatomy of melancholy. How do you study empirically melancholy? But back to the book. Dahlia points out, this is a long-standing metaphor, and the way one can anatomize the parts of a book suggests the transference. Yeah, transference you're suggesting it. That's absolutely, and Renee agrees too. That's just great. If anyone else wants to jump in on that excellent point, then please feel free. Oh, please, yeah, go ahead, Dahlia.
It's actually, I wanted to pick up on what John was just talking about, John M, not John S, because I had a question for you, John, that's basically about, I'm really interested in what you were saying about routinized knowledge work. And I guess I wanted to know, does it always produce abstraction? Or maybe even more than that, like I want to know, like, what is abstraction like anyway? Because I'm thinking about Carolyn Herschel's like transforming observations into charts and tables. And this is like, for me, explicitly like Baconian, right? It's like an enactment of like this like inductive method. But abstraction, which Bacon often aligns with generalization, would be like another step beyond that. That is kind of like processing the data and extracting truth or some kind of general conclusions out of it. And so I'm curious what you think about like that, like, does the accumulation of data and this kind of like the possibility that routinized knowledge work produces these specific genres or forms that seem to abstract it from observation, but does it ever like, does that actually like fulfill the promises of induction? I almost feel like you were suggesting it does. So that's the end of my question. Okay. I know that was complicated, but whatever.
Thank you. And yes, and your book is excellent on this specific subject, and I was hoping you would ask a version of this question. Yes, abstraction in that mode is taken as basically cleaning the data, getting it to a point where you have a total vision of the phenomenon as an object of knowledge, or a system. Caroline's published work does do that, yes. But what interests me about abstraction is its excessiveness. It's very hard to sort of keep a handle on it once you start that procedure going, and it very quickly threatens to overwhelm the goals that it's supposed to be serving. And you see this the proliferate, yeah, so like big data big data exhibits some of the tendencies that interest me in this way, where you see those AI monstrosities, right, that come up with these, I don't know if you guys have seen like the artificially generated gravity's rainbow, or these computers making composite faces that this person does not exist, right? These sorts of things. I feel like those, I have mixed feelings about that particular genre of like digital, of digital media experimentation. But what I think it shows is the fact that when we're quantifying, we can very quickly go off the rails with the process, and that can, and it's a very dangerous game to play, because you can end up needing the picture to be perfect. And so like backfilling and subtracting, all of it, making sure that you really have cleaned everything so that your model works. Or what's almost worse, you can like take the model really seriously and then start doing all of these fudge factors to keep it rolling until suddenly it like really breaks, right? But the alternative model is what Blake talks about when he says in this letter to Butts, I get carried away. He says that I'm carried away. Yeah, he gets lost in these worlds of dreams and abstractions. I'm carried away by it. Yeah, I get carried away with it and it carries me away, right? It's almost like word for word what Riley is saying. And I don't think that she's looking for a totalizing vision at all. And I think Caroline did make something that was used to those ends. And I don't think it was an accident. I think that's what she meant to do. But when you look at like her biography, there are all sorts of interesting details about how that came to pass. About the way that she has to, and specifically the excess gets viewed with her approach to intellectual labor, where she has to turn into her own middle manager. She has to, she invents the procedure essentially that they end up using that you saw in that simulator. And she pushes their procedure so far that eventually William can't handle it and he leaves and goes and gets married. And she just stays crunching the numbers. And it's almost this like, it's almost a revenge plot, her doing this, her showing her brother that he doesn't have what it takes. And in that way, like the specific challenge that it would pose to the School of Astronomy that comes to pass is, if it's going to be industrialized and if it's going to be this big standing reserve of knowledge, then what is the potentially alternative vision that she puts out there? And I think it's something like, she puts out something that's far too large for anybody to reasonably claim ownership over, and challenges that mode of the genius knowledge producer that she, through her professional life, actually facilitated the production of. That would be the sort of against the grain reading of her work in abstraction.
Thanks very much, John. That's wholesome and super intriguing answer. And I see John Savarese has a comment too in the chat. John writes, I wonder about the anatomy of the mind problem. Lots of writers, Alexander Gerard, Thomas Reid, were careful to say that the anatomy of the mind was just a metaphor and that anatomical observation couldn't get us anywhere when it comes to studying the mind's components. And that was linked to the problem Renee mentions, the lack of examples, right? Reid says, you can only study the mind through introspection, hence are limited to one case study. And you say that Baillie seems to be pushing back against all of that. Thank you, John.
Or I could phrase that as a question.
Sure, sure.
Renee, is that what Bailey's doing in your view? I mean, I think that's what I think she's probably doing. But in terms of trying to find more examples or look at, yes, you can look into other people's minds in this way. Is that a technique of fiction, or like what's the relationship between the fictionality which grants you that kind of access and that the way that she's, as you put it, supplementing the medical process?
Right, supplementing the medical process. Yes, so I think, well, it's so interesting, the term mind as opposed to brain, as opposed to soul. So what's really curious to me is kind of the slippage between them all, because Jane, who is used as kind of the like failed reader, right, in DeMontfort, is more of the mind as soul, right? So it's a failure of soul, like a broke, so I think, let me get back to your original question. Okay, anatomy of the mind, Alex Gerard, Thomas Reid, as a metaphor.
Well, I mean, for Baillie, is it a metaphor? It's not for her. It's
right.
Really,
right. That's what I don't think it is for her. And I think pushing back against it, it's not a metaphor. And I think the problem is needing examples and art filling that gap, right? Providing the opportunity to kind of extrapolate beyond the examples that we have or don't have, right? So kind of providing where the medical science stops, or imagining based on what we know. So yeah, I do think she's pushing back, like you're saying. Sorry, I kind of got caught up in the first paragraph of your question.
That's great. Thanks, Renee.
Yeah.
And
Can I
John.
pick up on that?
Oh yeah, sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, I thought that, John, your comment just made me think a lot of the way Hume, he gets all tangled up. Like he's trying to investigate how people's brains work, how their minds work, not their brains. And he first says, well, I'm going to use people, like case studies of actual people. But then he realizes he has no case studies of actual people, so he uses literature. And that's this has always struck me as a paradigmatic problem for the sciences of the mind in this period, is where do you get enough case studies to actually, where is your natural history of people's behavior other than literary text, which is what Edmund Burke does too. And I feel like it's people like Baillie and maybe Mariah Edgeworth. Mariah Edgeworth is I'm going to build my own database and I'm going to use kids in order to do it. Here we go, little experimental universe in the Edgeworth household. But it feels like it's people like Baillie and Edgeworth. Maybe I'm going back to this idea of a feminist approach that think we need a database, let's make one. Is this Carolyn Herschel too? Right? I think there's some kind of way in which all of these women figures are actually pressing towards the desire to have a database that a lot of the philosophers that we're talking about, Reid and others, Hume, are just willing to say, well, I'll just use something else because it's too hard to get this stuff we need. Anyways, that was just a random thought that I had. And I feel like these questions, though, are very provocative to think about, why is it that women are the ones pursuing so adamantly these kind of to build the database of mind science that seems to be missing, and that is needed apparently for the production of knowledge in this area in the Romantic period. So I don't know, maybe it is a feminist thing. Who knows?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think also this speaks to, John, your point about the audiences of both ballads and also her theatrical work, right? So not only, right, is she creating this database, as you say, Dahlia, for medical sciences as well as perhaps the philosophical community, but she's also writing it for the theater, right? So for a certain level of society, for educational purposes, and creating these experiments in that way. So she has that audience for kind of social experimentation or social education as well. And then you have the ballads in her other, kind of outreach efforts.
Thanks, Renee and Dahlia. Please, John, go ahead, but I want to follow up after you say what you have to say. I want to ask you something specifically too, but please go ahead.
I was just thinking in both of what you just said, Dahlia and Renee, it's interesting how the normative and descriptive are so tied up, they're tangled up in this kind of endeavor, right, for Baillie, especially when you're thinking about the theater as a kind of laboratory, but it's also a school, and it's actually inculcating certain, values. And that seems to be true too if we're talking about, building a database. There's not building a database, but each item in the database was built according to the premise of the person building it. And in this case, that means it looks a lot more like it's like a conjecture or a thought experiment about what should happen according to what my convictions about how the mind works. So is it normative or descriptive is always going to be one of those tough questions when we're thinking about somebody like Baillie building a database. But building a database is such a great alternative to thinking about it as this kind of laboratory space that really is, trying to tease out the anatomy of the mind. So I really like that metaphor for thinking about what she's doing.
Yeah, I really like that too. And this conversation we're having right now is leading me to my question to you, John, this idea of, that the database, which is the object of study, can it be normative, which suggests that, the gaze controls the object of the gaze, and then, what's in that database is, you know, the object of the gaze. And it leads me to a point that I had about your paper, John Savarese. And that is a major point you make, is that here I'm quoting from your paper, that Baillie, like Thompson, thought of song as a medium for cultivating and regulating feelings at the individual and collective level, which, you know, that's such a useful idea. And so you're saying essentially that she's teaching her society how to regulate their feelings through song. Okay, fine. But then I wonder how that idea relates to this next one, another one from your paper, that that Baillie is, quote, placing the viewer in the role of a diagnosing physician and a taxonomist of disorders. So I wonder, you know, can the audience be both shaped by Baillie through her song, and that way be the kind of object of her sort of maybe philosophical study or her study of the mind, and be the alternatively, you know, objective diagnosing physician? So in one case, the reader listener is the object of the gaze, and then in the next, she's the gaze itself. So I just wonder how you see these positions as relating.
No, that helps me, I think, with one knot that I was trying to figure out, which was the kind of hierarchy of artwork, the hierarchical ideas of the artist as somebody who kind of gives the examples, does the training, and that comes out of sort of a history of art theory that I associate with someone like Thomas Percy, who thought, you know, it goes back to these bardic figures who were like leaders and that would teach lesser folks how to behave, right? This very hierarchical view of how society develops. And there are lots of alternatives to that hierarchized model. So are we seeing something like that happen here? For Baillie, I think the key is that what we see going on in the theater, or the reason that we like theater in the first place, it's because this tendency to try to show examples and to analyze and to dissect and to train people's passions, it's something that happens institutionally in a theater, but she's so careful to route it back to something that we all do naturally, that's built into every, like we already do this. Right? This is not me, the medical authority speaking. This is all of us, the people who are just obsessed with dissecting other people's minds. So there's that kind of universalism to her version of the argument that would seem like the theater is just a great occasion for it to happen. It happens as much through the way that we kind of through a Smithian, you know, impartial spectatorship, enforce these things in ourselves through watching the play, as it does just looking at the other people around us in the theater, which the, you know, playwright acting company has no control over. So it is kind of decentralized in that way. So there's still this, she's kind of wrangling with what is the work of a more centralized model of artwork when it's building on these things, which really are these much more decentralized or you know universal or natural kinds of propensities that she's interested in. I think that would be, I'm not sure if that's an answer, but I think that
no, it is. It is an answer. Yeah, no, I think it's great. And thanks also for bringing up that really interesting moment that you mentioned in your paper, in which the audience members are looking at each other as much as they are also looking at the stage. And, you know, and you can imagine this also in kind of listening to the song. And you mentioned at some point the readers of the ballot that Baillie points out that in the lowest, as she says, the lowest orders of the classes. And I immediately thought, well, I don't think there'll be readers then, right? But then you cover this, I think, so well in your paper when you talk about the rurality of the ballot. So perhaps she's using that phrase reader in this kind of more general sense, not necessarily literally reading a text, but in so much as, I think, Renee, it was in your paper when you point out that Baillie uses reading as, you know, interpreting personality and mind and that kind of thing. So it allows for this kind of more expansive vision of what's going on in this, this context. And Lisa Ann, I have a question before we run out of time. I have a burning question for you, Lisa Ann, and it actually kind of it follows nicely, I think, from what John just said about, you know, what we do naturally. Because there's something in your paper, Lisa Ann, that really struck me. You say that, quote, the novel's primary argument is that women's minds, like men's, are governed by the universally established law of nature. And this is after Baillie's commentary. And it struck me, that's a really hot topic at the time, especially with regard to gender, because it's precisely this nature's law that so many misogynistic diatribes, let's just call it what it is, right, were written about the woman question or women's equality. And that is that women are naturally physically weaker than men, they would point out, and therefore, and I guess, given the mind-body connection, that is one of our topics for the day today, and that you map out partly, women's minds must therefore be weaker too, right? It must be kind of a reflection of their body. So I wonder, do you think, does Hughes tackle this thorny topic specifically? And one of the reasons why I asked that is that, you mentioned Wollstonecraft at the end, and of course, I was thinking of Wollstonecraft throughout your entire paper, because Wollstonecraft deals with this precise question, doesn't she, in The Rights of Woman, when she, she has this long bit when she says, I know we tend not to be as physically strong, and then she tries to make an argument for why that shouldn't apply to the mind too. So I'll just leave off there and leave you to the question, please, Lisa Ann.
So, I think that the answer in a way is yes, and I'm going to be a bit meandering because I think about Mary Robinson's, I don't know if it's called Letter to Women of England or, but she has this little treatise to women. And one of the things she says is, if you think that women are weaker than men, let's put a serving maid up against a fop, like an aristocracy, a man of the aristocracy, and you show me the milkmaid is stronger. So I think that there's a way in which, Hughes is trying to make an argument. What's interesting is I think that Hughes is actually sort of more leaning towards the common sense school, which is more of a dualist school, which then it doesn't really matter what the body is like, because, the mind is not necessarily attached to the body in the same way as, say, a materialist view of cognition would say. However, her women tend to be, and she has more characters than just the protagonists who are in fact mentally clear, rational women. And I was thinking about it in relationship to Belinda, what makes it different from Belinda. And they also tend to be strong, physically strong, like the fact that this protagonist can tie a sheet around her waist and then rappel down is really, I think part of the reason this novel jumped out at me so much is what differentiates it from Belinda is it seems to be saying more than just we must be rational, right? We must rely on our reasons more than our emotion. And in fact, seems to be engaging more directly with those kinds of debates. The thing that people were talking about before, it occurred to me, why am I worried about, is she really doing science? And this conversation has actually really helped me to flesh that out. So one of the things that, that Renee was talking about is Baillie picking up where medical science stops, and then the discussion of women potentially creating databases of, case studies. Why would one be considered science and the other not be considered science? And I don't really have answers here. This is kind of a new area for me. But the thing that I think is really interesting is why would something like Baillie's plays or this novel that I've read, or Baillie trying to influence people through song be considered less quote unquote scientific than, say, the stuff that Darwin or Hartley or any number of inductive reasoners whose science seems pretty fast and loose by our contemporary standards. So that, I don't know, that's something, I think that one of the things I'm thinking about is, why are women not necessarily included in histories of science? I know why, but sort of how does that narrative that women weren't doing science get constructed? And the other thing too, Michelle, that you sort of pointed out is I need to read some of these. I need to read more than Richard Powell's The Unsexed Female. But to read some of these arguments, these misogynistic arguments, because one of the things that strikes me with the guys I read, and I read a lot of male, you know, they're not talking in terms of gender. Now we all know that in their head, they're probably like thinking of a white man. You know what I mean? Like this is what the universal like subject is to them. But the thing that strikes me about Hughes is she seems to be taking those arguments and saying, I don't know why this phrase comes to my head, but what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? So if you're going to frame these theories of mind and not explicitly express or address gender, why wouldn't they apply equally? And the mind-body connection, since that's typically more what I'm interested in, I think is a really good route of exploration and a bit of a, what do I want to say, like a little naughty thing to look at in this particular novel because their minds and bodies, like I said, they're both strong, even though I think if I dug more deeply, she would be sort of leaning towards a dualist view of mind. That was kind of a long thing.
No, it was great. Thank you. It's really thorough and it addresses my questions really well. Let's see. Matthew Sangster in the chat has written, and I just want to point out before I get off that screen that Merv Akhtar writes to everyone about Aaron Goss's Revealing Bodies Anatomy Allegory and the Grounds of Knowledge. That's great. It might be a useful source. And interesting how Goss claims that the body can only be an allegorical figure that cannot help but be a means to speak otherwise, as the thing named in the use of the term the body is never the thing meant, right? That's great. And Dahlia comments on the butts of all of our conversations. And so Matthew Sangster writes, might John Plancher be helpful here? Modern science made in institutional spaces, dividing older notions of arts and sciences, right? And it's partly in the male-dominated institutional making that women get sidelined, right? Oh, I see you make your connection there, correct in there. Thanks very much, Matthew. I think that's really smart. Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Do you want to kind of add to that or kind of turn it into a question, or are you happy to leave it as I think, a very wise comment? More comment. Okay, cool. That's fine. Good.
Well, can I
yeah, please.
Anyone
can.
I mean,
yeah.
So, like, there's a way in, like, yes, it's a very male-dominated institution that was made, and women were sidelined for all the obvious reasons, right? But when I think like this whole the motivation behind this panel is like women doing science, and so there's a whole area of study in which we're interested in looking backward to find instances of women doing science, because history is there's so much erasure in history, right? But when I think about like us looking backwards, and are we trying to justify that these women were doing science? Do we think of the science they were doing differently than we think of the science that they're, I think that John Mulligan makes a really good argument that in fact, Carolyn and William Herschel were doing the same kinds of science, or, equally sciencey science, right? And so more than just sort of like institution making, I think I'm interested in definitions. And it's similar to what a Wollstone or a Harriet Hughes argument would be. Is like, if we look at definitions and how things get defined, can we classify these activities as science? And then, women's activities would be classified under there, regardless of their sidelining. And because it's simply a fact that like women did have access to home laboratories, et cetera, but for some reason they did not seem, unless they just haven't come to light yet, writing the same kinds of treatises that men did. But I guess it just seems to me that there could be more of an answer than just that, men create things and sideline women for various reasons that many philosophers, feminist philosophers have addressed.
Can I jump in on that?
Please.
When I started working with the Herschels years ago, what fascinated me about their laboratory setup is that you can completely legitimately read the evolution of Caroline Herschel's life as one in which She is, briefly liberated from being, made a maid in her own house by her mother, and becomes a scientific professional, only have to have those, and a musical professional, only to have those hopes dashed by William exploiting her labor and turning her into, again, another, rote worker, a rote worker, but in a different way. You can read it that way, but there are also these moments in there are also these moments as they develop their method where you see that, of course, William wants to take the higher status work and demote her to the lower status work, but they don't know which is the routinizable process yet. And so there's this churn that goes on for a couple of years where they're like she does a thing and he sees it and he copies it, but he already gave her the telescope to have her go test it out, right? So he's trying things out with her as an instrument, and if they play out, then he goes and does it, right? And when it comes to their vertical sweeping, this is the only time when she's critical of him, because she says in a couple journal entries, I've been doing this for months. And he's writing in his journal, so I started doing this thing, right? And so they keep doing this, but I think but that procedure that they did, it just cranked out discoveries, right? It's monstrous. He's suddenly tethered to this telescope and he can only tell when to go up and go down, but that's already that's baked in by the parameters, unless he wants to screw up their sweeps. So he's tied to the thing too. And all of a sudden, there's no distinguishing it anymore. And so to come back to Dahlia's earlier question about databases and the implicit question of why would women scientists be interested in this kind of intellectual labor? I think that I have a really dumb answer to the second question that I'll just start with, which is that when you start producing knowledge on this scale, it makes a lot of work. There's a lot of work to be done, and it is not, and that creates opportunities for people to do more of it, right? I think it's Mary Somerville who tries to describe to upper class women how they might do the sort of thing that she does, and she describes her own work process of taking care of her children and keeping all of her math papers stuffed in the couch cushions so that the second they leave the room, she can take them out and start working again, right? And that's not ideal, as a scientist, but on the other hand, she's identified that there's this that there's an open field there, right? That there's so much to be done that a person with a certain amount of learning can credibly contribute to it. And that's not, again, ideal. But then, so to the database question, I have photographs from the RAS of that show decompositions of Caroline Herschel's methods of putting together these sweeps, because they did all of these observations and she had to pre-process a bunch of data to make it possible to do that, because they had to know what they were looking for to know when they found something new. And then after all of it, she has to compile them all and correct for time on all of these to get the coordinates exactly right. And when she goes through all of these, they didn't do them in order because these coordinates are arbitrary and you can look at it a bunch of different ways. So she starts cutting out of her journals or her notebooks all of her second drafts of the sweeps. So this looks exactly, right? This looks exactly like the inductive method being worked out with the Coleridge example of the book being cut up that throws him into a tizzy. She does this to her own work in order to basically be able to do sort operations on different parameters so that she can get her data in order and say oh, these two are the same observation, right? And sort them and stack them. So she literally is doing a database thing. Sorry.
It's amazing. Just the sheer volume of work is staggering. So John makes a good point about Sarah Zimmerman's book on the romantic literary lecture, doing interesting work on women in the audience and how they influence the institutional discourse from those sidelines. I love that. And Matthew, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, John.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
Two more things. Yeah, I totally agree with that recommendation. And I also want to say to John that there's a reversibility that happens in mesmerism between the person who's being diagnosed and the physician, right? Where because they're diagnosing themselves, I think it's Alison Winter's book, right? You have the patient suddenly taking the show over, and the physician can't quite stop them because that would stop the show, right?
Right. The puppet takes over.
Yeah. And with the citizen science example, I think that's really smart too, because in the transition from the popular sciences, right, these voluntary societies, to the industrial sciences, that gets shut. That's typically told in history as like a hard break, right? As you go from small science to big science. I'm guilty of buying into that sometimes, but obviously there's details to be worked out, right? There's tensions in there, and like I see sometimes in the Herschel's like her exploiting that tension.
Yeah, and you're suggesting, the kind of question boundaries between disciplines, one of our favorite topics when we talk about romantic science and literature. And I think that leads us back nicely to Lisa Ann's, kind of question to herself, like, why do I say that she's not maybe sciencey enough? And I think this is always kind of a question for us when we do this kind of work. But on the other hand, these weren't really strongly defined disciplines. And I think you guys have pointed out so well here that in fact, this lack of disciplinary distinction is partly by design, because they were inventing their own kind of databases and, examples for study in literature. So that means that they are, melded. So that's I think that's lovely. So Matthew, we're dying to hear from you here. You say, you guess the point would be that, I love this, very pithy, would be that men create, but that men narrow to cut women out. A similar argument to Anne Malore's argument on the eclipse of female poets. Sorry, go ahead, Matthew, yes.
Yeah, so I think I buy the point that women are doing in this period are doing important work that we would now call science, but I think it is important that they wouldn't call it science. They're working in a broader natural philosophical or arts and sciences kind of model, and that what they get sort of pushed out of science precisely by a narrowing that happens later on. So I think I'm always a little bit cautious about strictly claiming things as science before that kind of second quarter of the 19th century narrowing, partly because that narrowing cuts a load of stuff out and loses a whole lot of positive attributes of earlier forms of science. So that's my only sort of slight concern. It's a very similar argument, as I said in the comment to Anne Malore's argument, that sort of male romantic poets accrue a lot of formally feminized virtues, and that becomes a model of poetry that male poets achieve authority over because they're in institutionalizing processes. They're sort of more well placed to be put in that position. And it's sort of the pattern you see in literature, that sort of people like Eliza Hayward and Charlotte Smith are enormously popular because the publishers and the reprinters and all sorts of other figures, males, sort of selectors and anthologizers, not exclusively important people like Barbauld, of course, but in large part, and particularly when things get into institutions of education, those sort of contributions get edited out at the edge. And I think something similar is happening as sort of arts and sciences or natural philosophy narrow in these specialized scientific societies like the chemical and the astronomical that were brought up in the papers.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Matthew. That's it's so good. And it summarizes, I think, really well what our wonderful panelists and people contributing to the conversation through the chat and otherwise have accomplished here today. It's exactly two. I think, hey, maybe we should just call it a day and please everyone join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. It's just such a great, great day. So much to think about. I have to go think even more about what has passed here. I want to thank all of our speakers and everyone in the audience and everyone who contributed otherwise in the conversation as well. So that's our day today. That is the Her Information Various panel, Women in Romantic Science. So thank you, everyone. It was great, and I look forward to seeing this wonderful conversation posted to YouTube soon.
Thanks, Michelle, for hosting.
My great pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
It
Michelle.
was a great pleasure. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, bye.